Welcome back to the Shadows. I'm the Sightless storyteller. Tonight, I have gathered a collection of accounts for you, a journey through the corners of the world. These are tales of the unseen and the unheard, curated for those who aren't afraid to sit in the dark for a little longer than usual.
I've always said that sight is a distraction. People who see the world are blinded by the surface of things, the color of paint, the brightness of a bulb, the clutter of a room. But when you are sightless, you understand the true skeleton of a place. You understand its geometry through the way sound bounces off the corners. You understand its age by the way the air tastes of stagnant dust. That's why, when my friends dared me to spend an hour in the old Blackwood infirmary, I wasn't afraid. To them, it was a terrifying ruin filled with shadows. To me, it was just a series of empty boxes. The Blackwood Infirmary had been abandoned since the late 70s. It sat on the edge of town, a hulking carcass of brick and broken glass. My friends dropped me off at the rusted iron gates, their voices high and tight with a nervous energy they tried to mask as bravery. They gave me a two-way radio for safety, they said, and watched as I tapped my way up the cracked concrete path. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the world changed. The outside world had a constant hum, traffic, wind, the distant thrum of life. But inside the infirmary, the air was dead. It was thick and heavy, smelling of wet plaster, rusted metal, and the faint, lingering chemical sting of floor wax that had long since dried into the floorboards. I began to move. My cane sent out a sonar pulse, telling me that the hallway was wide, with high ceilings and doors every 10 feet. I could hear the wind whistling through the shattered window panes upstairs, a lonely, ghostly sound that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the building. "I'm in the lobby," I said into the radio. Static hissed back at me, hollow, empty sound. I tucked the radio into my pocket and kept moving. I reached the first staircase. The wood was soft in places, swollen with decades of rain. I climbed slowly, my senses pushed to their absolute limit. I could hear the scurrying of mice in the walls, the tiny scratch of their claws against lath and plaster. But then I heard something else. It was a sound that didn't belong in a graveyard of a building. It was the sound of a page turning. I stopped. I tilted my head, filtering out the wind and the mice. There, in the room to my left, a soft, crisp crinkle flip, then silence. I moved toward the doorway, my heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached out a hand and touched the doorframe. The wood was jagged, the paint peeling away in long dry strips that felt like dead skin. I stepped into the room. The acoustics told me it was small, an office perhaps. I felt the edge of a metal desk, cold and pitted with rust. My fingers brushed across a stack of papers. They were brittle, turning to dust at the slightest pressure. But as I touched them, I felt a vibration through the desk. Someone was walking in a room with me, but they weren't walking on the floor. The sound was coming from the ceiling. I looked up, or rather, I turned my face toward the sound. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, but they weren't the sound of boots on wood. They were the sound of bare feet on a wet surface. I reached for my radio. "Guys, are you pulling a prank? Did someone climb in through the fire escape?" No answer. Only the hiss of the static, which was beginning to change. The static was forming words. It was a low, rhythmic chanting, so faint I thought it might be my imagination. "Count the steps. Count the steps. Count the steps." I backed out of the room, my cane sweeping frantically in front of me. I turned to head back to the stairs, but my cane didn't hit the floorboards I expected. It hit something soft, something vertical. I reached out, thinking I had bumped into a hanging curtain or a piece of plastic sheeting. But what my fingers met was hair. Long, matted, ice-cold hair that smelled of formaldehyde and stagnant water. I gasped and recoiled, my heel catching on a loose board. I fell backward, the air rushing out of my lungs. I scrambled to find my cane, my hand sweeping across the floor. All I felt was the thick, velvet layer of dust and the sharp edges of broken glass. Then the silence of the building was shattered. From every direction, the hallway, the rooms, the floor above, and the basement below, the footsteps started. Thousands of them. It sounded like a tide of wet bodies was rushing toward me, closing the distance. I found my cane and lurched to my feet, sprinting toward where I thought the stairs were. But the building had shifted. The hallway felt longer, the doors closer together. I was running through a throat that was slowly swallowing me. I reached the stairs and threw myself down them, not caring if I broke a limb. I hit the lobby floor and scrambled for the front door. The scent of the outside world, the fresh, cold night air, was so close. Just as I reached the door, the radio in my pocket screamed. It wasn't static anymore. It was a chorus of voices, hundreds of them, all whispering the same thing I had heard in the office. "You forgot to count the steps," they hissed. I burst through the doors and collapsed onto the gravel, the iron gates clanging shut behind me as my friends ran toward me. They were laughing, asking if I'd seen any ghosts. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, gasping for breath, my hands buried in the dirt. It wasn't until we got back to the car that I realized why they were looking at me with such horror. I thought I had just fallen in the dust. But as I ran my hand down my arm, I didn't feel dust. I felt dozens of tiny, wet handprints, perfectly formed, covering my jacket from the shoulders to the waist. The Blackwood Infirmary was abandoned by the living, yes, but it was far from empty. And now every time I sit in a quiet room, I find myself counting. Because I know that somewhere, in a building that doesn't exist on any map anymore, something is still counting back.
I have lived in this house for 42 years, and for 30 of them, I have been blind. People often assume that living in total darkness in a house built in 1890 would be a nightmare, but they don't understand the intimacy of it. I don't see this house, I feel its pulse. I know the way the air thinned in the parlor during the winter, and the way the kitchen smelled of damp limestone after a heavy rain. To me, the house wasn't a structure of wood and brick. It was a living, breathing companion. Until last October. It started with a change in the weight of the air. You might not notice it if you have your sight, but when you rely on the pressure of the room against your skin, you notice when a space feels occupied. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one with the frayed velvet arms that smelled of faint pipe tobacco and old dust. The grandfather clock in the hall was ticking its usual, comforting rhythm. Talk, talk, talk. But then the rhythm shifted. There was a pause between the seconds. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. I stood up, reaching for my cane, but I stopped. I didn't want to make a sound. For the first time in 3 decades, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I reached out a hand to touch the wall, expecting the familiar texture of the floral wallpaper, the slight ridges of the printed roses I had traced 1,000 times. But the wallpaper felt different. It was warm. Not the warmth of a sun-drenched wall, but the humid, radiating heat of a living body. I pulled my hand back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I moved toward the kitchen, my slippers silent on the hardwood. I knew every creak in these floors. I knew to avoid the third board from the door and the soft spot near the radiator. But as I stepped, the floor didn't creak. Instead, it felt soft. It gave way beneath my feet like I was walking on thick, damp moss. I reached the kitchen counter, my fingers gripping the cold marble for comfort. And then I smelled it. It wasn't the smell of an old house. It was the smell of a deep, forgotten well. Wet earth. Ancient copper. And something sweet, sickly sweet, like rotting lilies. I heard a sound then. It wasn't a floorboard or a settling beam. It was a wet, sliding noise coming from the ceiling directly above me. It sounded like something heavy and skinless was being pulled across the plaster. "Who's there?" I whispered. My voice felt small, swallowed by the sudden density of the room. The sliding stopped. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. I stood frozen, my ears straining so hard they began to ring. And then I heard the breathing. It didn't come from the corners of the room. It didn't come from the doorway. It was coming from the wall I was leaning against. a long, slow, rattling inhalation that vibrated through the marble and into my fingertips. I realized then that the house wasn't just a shell. The space between the walls, the dead space, where the pipes and wires ran, wasn't empty anymore. Something had filled it. Something that had grown too large for the architecture. I began to back away, moving toward the front door. But as I moved, the house began to change around me. The hallway, which I knew to be 6 paces wide, felt like it was narrowing. I reached out both arms, and my palms pressed against the walls on either side. They were closing in. The wallpaper was no longer dry. It was tacky, sticking to my skin like sap. I reached the front door and fumbled for the deadbolt. My fingers were shaking so violently I could barely grip the metal. Just as the bolt clicked open, I felt a puff of air on the back of my neck. It was cold, ice cold, and it smelled of the same copper and earth. A voice, if you could call it that, didn't speak into my ear. It spoke inside the wood of the door I was touching. A low, grinding vibration that felt like stones rubbing together. Stay, it hummed. The walls are finally full. I didn't wait. I threw the door open and stumbled out onto the porch, the cold night air hitting me like a physical blow. I didn't stop until my feet hit the gravel of the driveway. I turned back, my sightless eyes staring at where I knew the house stood. The night sounds, the crickets, the distant wind, seemed to stop at the edge of the property. From the direction of the house, I heard one final sound. It was the sound of a massive, wooden ribcage settling. A heavy, satisfied thud. I never went back. I left everything, the furniture, the heirlooms, the memories. Because I knew that if I had stayed one more minute, the walls wouldn't have just closed in. They would have swallowed me, and I would have become just another vibration in the wood, waiting for the next person to walk through the door.
These accounts belong to those who learned that the dark is never really empty. This collection may be over, but there are always more voices waiting to be heard in the silence. Leave a comment and tell me which of these stories shed you the most. I'm the Sightless Storyteller. Thank you for listening, and sleep well if you can.